Chapter 6. The even chimes sounded over the city of Wither. Garrett had to get home before curfew. No, he was already home, in his bed. His eyes fluttered open to find the long shadows of night already filling his room. A cold, damp rag lay across his forehead, and his entire body ached when he tried to move. He looked to his bedside table and saw the faint glow of Lampwick. She lay curled asleep on a bed she had fashioned from the piece of bread he had given her. The grapes, untasted, were strewn about the cage floor. He heard voices in the hall. "Uncle?" In a moment he heard footsteps, and the door creaked open. Uncle Tingen entered, followed by a grinning Max Zara and the tattooed cynic. "He survived," Zara laughed. "I guess we don't get to zombify him after all." Uncle ignored him. "How are you feeling, Garrett?" "Sore," he answered. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Uncle said. "You performed admirably." "Is my zombie all right?" Zara laughed. "He's a necromancer, all right." "Your zombie is fine," Uncle said. "He's downstairs. You can name him when you're feeling better." Garrett tried to lift himself, but his arms shook with effort. He fell to bed again, and the room seemed to rock like a boat around him. "I said when you're feeling better," Uncle scolded. "What's wrong with me?" Garrett gasped. "Resur-exhaustion," Zara said. Uncle winced. "At least that's the term I invented to describe it," Zara continued. "Hasn't quite caught on with the older members of our profession. Anyway, it happens to all of us the first time." "Some of us," Cynic corrected. "All of us," Zara repeated. "Anyway, nothing to worry about. You'll be fine after a night's rest." "Indeed," Uncle Tingen said. "All the more reason for us to be leaving him to it." The three necromancers bid Garrett good night and turned to go. "Cynic," Garrett called out, "can I ask you a question?" "Certainly, Garrett. What is it?" Garrett waited until Uncle and Zara were out of earshot. "You know about fairies, right?" "Some, yes." "Do you know what they eat?" Cynic smiled sadly, an expression that looked like pain on his rune-marked face. He crossed the room to stand beside Lampwick's cage. He stood in silence for a moment, watching her sleep. "Do you know where fairies come from, Garrett?" Cynic asked. "The southern forests?" Cynic nodded. "Do you know how they were made?" Garrett shrugged his shoulders. Cynic took a moment to drag the chair from beside the window and sat down next to the bed. "Long ago," he said, "when the world was whole and new, the dragons were a great and beautiful race." Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his bed. "They weren't always as they are now, Garrett. The dragons were the creators of beauty. Through dragon song, they could call into existence creatures of pure magic." "What's dragon song?" Garrett asked. "They sang their magic, Garrett," he said, and his eyes softened, looking far away. "So the words were magical?" Garrett said. "Uncle told me that the words weren't important." "All words are important, Garrett. What Uncle meant was that we humans don't use magic that way. We possess a binding will that controls the magic we find in the world around us. We cannot make it ourselves. We cannot call magic into being with our words. The dragons could." "So the dragons made fairies?" Garrett asked. "And all the Fae folk," Cynic said. "Thus the Fae are not bound by the same rules as mortal men and beasts." "So they don't need to eat?" This idea appealed to Garrett. Perhaps Lampwick would not be so hard to care for after all. "They do not eat food as we do," Cynic said. "Then what do they eat?" Cynic's broad shoulders slumped and his lips tightened. "They live on hope, Garrett." "Huh?" "A fairy will live as long as it has hope. They love stories and songs and new experiences. Denied those things, they will fade and die." Garrett looked at the little fairy asleep in her cage. He felt sick. How am I supposed to feed her that? A captive fairy can live for a long time on the hope she has left, Cynic said. But eventually... What if I let her go? Garrett asked. How do I let her go? I do not know a way, Garrett. She is bound by vampire magic. The vampires know some of the old songs. They cannot make new things, but they can bind and control the old. I'll ask Marla then, Garrett said. She'll know what to do. Cynic smiled. Get some rest, Garrett. You made a fine zombie today. Thanks, Cynic, Garrett said. Good night, Garrett. Cynic pulled the door shut behind him. Garrett rolled onto his side and watched Lampwick sleep. Raise your left leg, Caleb, Garrett commanded. Garrett's zombie looked at him, his expression unreadable. He lifted his left foot a few inches off the kitchen floor. You see? Uncle harumphed and sipped his tea. Garrett frowned. Tom, the kitchen zombie, shambled over to lay a plate of scorched eggs in front of Garrett. Tom, he said, forgetting Uncle's policy on naming the servants. Raise your left leg. Tom stared at him and then looked slowly down at his boots. Ancient sinews creaked as the kitchen zombie lifted his right foot. Tom raised his head to look at Garrett again and then fell over sideways. The tea tray balanced on the edge of the countertop followed him to the floor with a crash. Uncle regarded Garrett in stony silence, taking another sip of tea. After you are done cleaning that up, Uncle said, you can join me in the library. We can then discuss your zombie's remarkable sense of balance. He stood, shaking his head at the fallen kitchen zombie, and walked from the room. Garrett grinned as he helped Tom get to his feet. The zombie stumbled back to his corner at Garrett's command, and the boy got to work. He knelt down to pick up the wet shards of a broken teacup. He reached for one that had skittered further away than the rest, and was suddenly aware that Caleb was standing above him. It occurred to Garrett that he hadn't told Caleb to stop standing on one foot. Zombies weren't supposed to think for themselves. He hoped that was a good thing. Caleb looked down at him, tilting his head slightly in puzzlement. You want to help? Garrett asked. Caleb stooped and reached for the broken piece. He swayed a little, bracing himself with his free hand against the wooden cabinet. Caleb's bloodless fingers closed upon the shard, feeling at it, not quite grasping it. Caleb moaned, sounding almost frustrated. You can do it, Caleb, Garrett said. Caleb's brow furrowed. He had a face that had probably been accustomed to laughter from the look of it, his hair curly and red, his eyes green. Garrett wondered what sort of person he had been before the Watchers got him. Uncle had dressed Caleb in the standard gray doublet and hose worn by the other servants. Zombie attire was a matter of personal taste among necromancers. Cynic kept his servants dressed in rich funerary garb and beaten gold death masks. Zara preferred black hooded robes. Jitlo dressed his zombies as a carnival troupe, much to Uncle's disapproval. Caleb's fingertips at last gripped the shard, and he gave a little groan of triumph. Good job, boy, Garrett said. He held out his hand, and Caleb deposited the shard in his open palm. Garrett rose and tossed the broken cup into the dust pail. Caleb leaned against the counter, standing up with deliberate slowness. Garrett smiled at his zombie. Let's go show Uncle what you can do. Chapter 7. Happy birthday, Garrett, Warren said. The ghoul held out a bundle of stained gravecloth. He had been waiting for Garrett at their regular meeting place, a junction in the tunnels beneath the old library. Thanks, Garrett said, stopping to take the gift. He passed his witchfire torch to the ghoul to free up his hands. Did Uncle tell you it was my birthday? Yeah, Warren said. I brought the body to the house myself. Your uncle had my dad looking for a good deader all last week. Thought we were going to have to dig one up at the last minute, but Dad came through with a fresh one just in time. Garrett finally managed to work loose the rough knots holding the bundle together, and the package spilled open. Inside lay what looked like a polished black stone a little larger than a finger. It was oblong, broken at one end, and tapered to a point. An uneasy feeling crept over him as he looked at it. What is it? Garrett asked. A tooth, Warren said. Dragon tooth, I think. At least it came out of a dragon slayer, so it stands to reason. Dragon Slayer?
Yeah, sir, something or other. I don't remember,
Warren said.
He had a Narvi sword, too, but my cousin got that.
Garrett touched the tooth with his fingertip. Even through his glove, he could feel its chill. The skin on the back of his neck tingled, and his face flushed, painfully warm. He quickly wrapped the tooth up again and put it in his pocket. Warren passed the torch back to him. Thanks, Warren, he said. I wish I could have gone to the catacombs with you.
Yeah, it was pretty fun. Well, it would have been more fun without Norris.
Your cousin?
Yeah, he's always going on about the old ways and how they do things down south. If Dad wasn't watching, I'd have kicked him in the down south.
Oh, did you see anything else?
Yeah, lots of stuff, Warren said. Tell me how the rezzing went.
Pretty good, I think, Garrett said.
So the zombie didn't go crazy and try to kill you or anything?
No.
Oh.
Warren sounded a little disappointed.
Well, where is he? Didn't you bring him?
No, Garrett said. Uncle had to take Caleb to the temple to get him registered.
Caleb?
Yeah, Garrett said. That's what I named him.
Caleb.
Warren wrinkled his snout.
Why not name him something really viral like Death Reaver or Bone Grinder?
I don't know, Garrett said. I just liked Caleb. Warren shook his head.
Well, what do you want to do today?
Can we go to the catacombs?
You mean that both of us sneak down there by ourselves without my dad knowing?
Yeah, Garrett said slowly.
Ha! I enjoy living too much, not a chance,
Warren said. It's not that dangerous, is it?
Yes, it is,
Warren said.
But that's not what I'm afraid of. My dad would kill me dead if I went down there without permission.
No, Garrett sighed. You want to go explore the old city?
Sure,
Warren said, turning toward the mouth of a downward-sloping tunnel. I need to stop by the market first, though, Garrett said.
What for?
Warren groaned. It'll only take a minute.
You're going to see that vampire girl, aren't you?
Hey, Garrett said. Marla gave me a really nice present, and I just wanted to say thanks.
Really?
Warren cocked his ears to a sarcastic angle.
What did she get you?
Garrett hesitated, his voice low. A fairy.
A what?
A fairy, Garrett repeated, louder this time. Warren burst into laughter, clutching his sides as he leaned against the tunnel wall.
Well,
he managed to say at last,
we'd better go and thank her then.
Garrett grumbled as the two of them headed up the tunnel toward the market. After a moment, he spoke again. When is your birthday, Warren?
Oh,
Warren said.
Ghouls don't celebrate birthdays, only death days.
Well, how do you know when your death day is?
You don't.
Garrett emerged from one of the many underground entrances hidden among the city's back alleys. He slipped through the narrow gap between the corners of the Dervish Ale House and the silk merchant's stall and stepped into the gray light of mid-morning. He made his way through the jostling crowds to the narrow lane of curious little magic shops. The shutters were drawn shut in the window of Mrs. Veranu's pet store. Nevertheless, Garrett knew, as the sign on the door assured him, they were open for business. The doorbells jingled as Garrett let himself in. He was careful to shut the door quickly, letting in as little light as possible. Hello? He called out as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior of the shop. Garrett, Mrs. Veranu's voice answered. We're in the back. Please join us. Garrett glanced around at the many tiny creatures locked in their cages on shelves or hooks. Fairy wings fluttered and tiny frilled chameleons flared their ruffs at him. He let himself through the gate and stepped behind the counter. He jumped when a bright red lizard in a silver cage hissed suddenly. He gave it a nasty look and hurried through the rune-marked curtain into the back room. Marla and her mother were kneeling on the floor, pinning a squirmy, furry creature down with their hands and knees. Marla greeted him, smiling, a wisp of her dark hair fallen across one eye. Her gray coveralls were rolled down to her waist, revealing a white linen undershirt that left her arms and shoulders bare. Garrett's heart leapt in his chest. He could only grin mutely in response. Mrs. Veranu smiled up at him as well, but so taken was he by her daughter's beauty, he did not at first realize that Mrs. Veranu wasn't wearing her scarf. Mrs. Veranu's eyes were sparkling and mischievous as ever, but Garrett drew back at the sight of her fanged teeth, bared in a white grin. Oh, hi, Mrs. Veranu, he stammered, hoping to cover his embarrassment. If she had noticed his reaction, she gave no sign. Give us a hand here, Garrett, she said, thinning her smile to an almost human appearance. Sure, he said. What do you want me to do? You see the collar there on the table? She asked. Yeah. Bring it here and lock it around the neck of this trilbit while Marla and I hold him down. Garrett had no idea what a trilbit was. Judging from the look of it, it was a beast the size of a large dog covered in brown fur and possessing a long, wet proboscis. It didn't look too dangerous, but if it took 2 vampires to hold it down, it had to be strong. Garrett picked up the collar from the table. The thick silver band looked heavier than it proved to be. Its surface gleamed with intricate filigree and interlocking circular runes. The trilbit's eyes went wide at the sight of it. Bring the collar, please, Garrett, Mrs. Veranu said. Her sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, and Garrett could see the muscles of her forearms tense and strain to hold the thrashing creature to the floor. Quickly, if you will. Garrett hastened to her side and cautiously stepped over the struggling trilbit, straddling it. He knelt and slipped the open ends of the interlocking collar over the creature's throat.
No, please!
A small, squeaky voice called out. The creature looked up at him, its wide golden eyes filled with panic. Garrett froze. The trilbit could talk. Now, Garrett! Mrs. Veranu shouted. Garrett gasped, stung into action. The collar snapped closed around the trilbit's neck. It slumped motionless on the floor. Garrett stumbled away from the creature, feeling a little sick.
Thanks, Garrett,
Marla said, placing a cool hand on his shoulder. Happy to help, he said. Well done, Garrett, Mrs. Veranu sighed, rising to her feet. She looked down at the collared trilbit. Back in your crate, she commanded. The trilbit rose, its eyes half-lidded, and plodded slowly toward a large wooden crate with a splintered side. The creature's long nails scritched on the hardwood floor as it walked. What is that thing? Garrett asked.
A trilbit,
Marla answered, as though that explained everything. Garrett watched as she dusted herself off and buttoned up her coveralls. I mean, what's it for?
Nothing much, really,
Marla shrugged.
A customer wanted one for a pet and placed an order with us.
So it'll be all right then? Garrett asked. They're not gonna hurt it or anything? Marla turned and regarded him for a moment, a little smile on her lips.
He'll be all right, Garrett.
Oh, good, he said. Now, Garrett, Mrs. Veranu said, how can we help you? Oh, he said, I wanted to say thanks for the fairy. Mrs. Veranu nodded. A Carowin song, Faye, she said. Marla picked that one out for you. Thanks, Marla, Garrett said. She's really amazing. Marla smiled, looking a little embarrassed. I see you're a member of the club now, Marla's mother grinned. Huh? Oh, this? Garrett lifted his fingers to the golden amulet on his chest. Yeah, I'm Uncle's apprentice now, officially. You couldn't ask for a better teacher, Mrs. Veranu said, her eyes looking far away. Yeah, he's great. Well, Mrs. Veranu said as she slapped the dust from her knees, I'd better write Ambassador Shaley a note to let him know his trilbit has arrived. Mrs. Veranu swept from the room with the speed and grace peculiar to the vampire race. A moment of silence hung in the air between Garrett and Marla. He smiled, and she smiled back, her eyes drifting in search of a suitable topic of conversation. Garrett cleared his throat. Thanks again for the fairy, he said.
Yeah,
Marla said.
Everything all right with it? I mean, do you have any questions about the fairy or anything?
Garrett chewed his lip, considering the wording of his question. What if, say, I wanted to let the fairy out of the cage for a bit, to let her fly around the room? Marla shook her head.
You'd never be able to catch it again.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering about, what if I ever did want to let her out? Garrett shuffled his foot to study his boot heel with some intensity, not daring to look her in the eyes.
Oh,
Marla said.
I understand. It's very sweet of you to want to set it free, but Garrett, It's only a fairy.
Yeah, Garrett said. So there's no way then? Marla put her hand on his shoulder.
Garrett, she said, every animal in this shop has been word-bound. They can never be free again.
Word-bound?
Word bonding is a sort of magic.
Marla's lips tightened, and she took on that schoolmistress look she favored when trying to explain something that seemed completely obvious only to her.
You see, she said, these are all fey creatures. They were sung into being by the great dragons long ago. The Word made them, and the Word can command them.
So you speak Draconic? Garrett asked. Marla's eyes flicked toward the curtained door, and her voice lowered.
I speak a little.
Garrett lowered his voice as well.
So you know the words to control magic creatures?
Marla's nose wrinkled the way it did when she tried to simplify a complex answer. At last, she just shrugged and nodded. So, Garrett said, if you can bind them with a word, couldn't you set them free with a word? A shuffling noise from the front of the shop made Marla jump. She shook her head and leaned close to Garrett.
I'm not supposed to talk about this, she whispered.
I'm sorry, Garrett whispered back. He was having a little trouble concentrating on anything other than the flowery scent of her dark hair. Marla stepped back and turned to arrange a few colored glass bottles on her workbench. Well, Garrett said, raising his voice, I guess I should go. Warren's waiting for me.
Warren the Ghoul?
Marla asked, her face brightening. Yeah, Garrett said.
We're going down to explore the old city today. You're going underneath the city? She asked.
Yeah, he said, and then with a sudden flash of boldness, do you want to come? Marla's eyes sparkled.
I'll have to ask.
Go ahead, Marla, her mother's voice called from the other room.
Have a good time.
Chapter 8. Marla drew the hood of her cloak down and stepped into the gray light of the day. Garrett passed her a worried look. Are you all right? He asked.
Of course. Why wouldn't I be?
I just thought that the sunlight...
Oh,
she said.
It's fairly diffuse here, and in any case, I'm still young enough to resist most of the adverse effects of daylight. It's worse for Mother, of course.
Oh, good, he said as they stepped into the gloom of the alley between shops.
What did you think would happen? She asked.
I don't know, he admitted. He tinted his fingers together and then pulled them rapidly apart, making an explosive noise with his mouth. Marla laughed.
And you still invited me out into the daylight?
Sorry, he said. I guess I didn't think about that.
I'm glad you asked me to come, she said. Is this it?
They stood before the great iron-bound door that led to the tunnels. Garrett reached up to pull hard at the rusty, twisted handle, making the ancient hinges screech in protest.
Let me help.
Marla grasped the edge of the door with one hand and pulled. Garrett staggered back as the door swung open effortlessly. Thanks. The dank smell of the tunnels washed over them as they stepped through the portal. Garrett's witch-fire torch flared to life, bathing them in its pale green glow. He descended the winding stone steps with Marla following close behind. When he reached the foot of the stairs, Garrett saw Warren stretched motionless on the tunnel floor. "Warren!" Garrett shouted.
Leave me alone,
the ghoul answered without opening his eyes.
I'm dead. I died of boredom waiting for you to get back.
Sorry, Garrett said. Mrs. Verhanu needs some help.
Yeah, right,
Warren groaned.
Couldn't have anything to do with that. Oh, hi.
Warren had just looked over and noticed Marla standing beside his friend. He rolled quickly into a crouch and flashed his wolfish grin.
Hello,
Marla said with a wary smile. I asked Marla if she wanted to come with us, Garrett said.
I hope it's all right,
Marla said.
I've never seen the old city.
Yeah, Warren said, giving Garrett an angry squint.
That's fine.
Good, Garrett said. Let's get going then. Marla did not move but made a little noise in her throat. She looked at Garrett expectantly. What? He asked.
Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?
Marla asked. Oh, Marla, this is Warren. He's a ghoul.
I welcome your presence,
Marla said, crossing her hands over her chest and bowing slightly. Warren, Garrett said, this is Marla.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Wait a minute,
Warren said, turning on Garrett.
How come you introduce me as the ghoul, but you just call her by her name?
I don't know, Garrett said. I just didn't want her to be scared of you. Marla stifled a giggle.
What? Warren growled. You think ghouls are scary and vampires aren't?
Garrett shrugged. Sorry, I didn't really think about it like that.
You wouldn't want the pretty little vampire girl to be scared of the big, ugly ghoul.
I didn't, Garrett said.
So how do you know that I'm a vampire?
Marla interrupted.
Psh, Warren scoffed. For one thing, Garrett won't stop talking about you.
Marla's white cheeks went suddenly pink.
And anyway, Warren continued, you smell funny. Warren, Garrett hissed. No, not bad funny, Warren said. Just kind of lizardy.
Garrett glared at him.
Well, you smell nice enough, Warren assured Marla. Just not like something I'd want to eat when you're dead.
Marla arched one eyebrow.
Thank you, she said. I wouldn't want to eat you either.
Warren looked simultaneously reassured and offended.
Can we go now? Garrett asked. Yeah, Warren said, his eyes still on the vampire. I want to see if we can find that collapsed passageway again. We can do some digging.
The three of them followed the brickwork tunnel as it sloped down. Water dripped from the occasional ceiling grate through which shafts of gray sunlight pierced the perpetual darkness. Soon, even these few reminders of the surface world disappeared, and the eternal, silent gloom of the underground closed around them. Garrett felt Marla draw closer behind him as they walked. Without thinking, he reached back, and she took his hand. Garrett's heart fluttered, and, for a moment, he wished that he'd been brave enough not to wear his gloves today. He gave her fingers a gentle squeeze and smiled back at her over his shoulder. Marla smiled as well.
Junction left, Warren called out as he reached a Y intersection in the tunnel. The leftmost branch sloped steeply down and echoed with the sound of a steady rivulet of dirty water emptying into the shaft. The shaggy ghoul braced his long arms against the walls of the narrow tunnel and began his descent. Garrett and Marla followed, leaning on one another for support. The light of the witchfire torch glistened on the damp gray tile fixed in spiral patterns across the tunnel wall. As they descended further beneath the city, the tiles presently gave way to smooth, seamless white stone. The thin layer of mortar that held the tiles to the wall had crumbled away from the polished rock. A broad pool of dark water marked the leveling point of the tunnel's slope. Warren's big hindpaws sent waves sloshing up the curved walls. Garrett's boots splashed with every step. Marla had released his hand and waited at the edge of the pool until the two boys had reached the other side. It's not very deep, Garrett said. I know, Marla replied, her eyes flickering across the surface of the water. Suddenly she moved. Her soft gray boots made no sound as she hopped lightly from one side of the pool to the other. Nice jump, Garrett said. Thanks. Warren harumphed and turned again to the tunnel ahead. Garrett started to reach for Marla's hand again, but she did not notice. She looked past him toward a strange, swirling rune engraved on the tunnel ceiling. Garrett, do you know what that is? Marla asked, an expression of delight on her face. Garrett hastily withdrew his hand, pretending to straighten the hood of his robe. I don't know, he said. They're all over the old city. It's draconic, Marla said. This is pre-fall architecture. Ah, Garrett said. What's it say? It was Marla's turn to look embarrassed. I don't know, she admitted. Something about singing. Warren snorted. Maybe there was a music hall ahead, Garrett said. Marla said, squinting at the runes. Not necessarily true. Singing was an integral part of the dragon's language. Everything in Draconic is sung. A chill ran across Garrett's skin. You mean a dragon wrote that? Warren's hooting laughter echoed through the hall. You think a dragon could squeeze his big butt inside this tunnel? Marla frowned. Not all dragons were very large, she said. And in any case, Wither was once an elven city. Elves are more than capable of inscribing draconic runes.
Oh, Garrett said, a little relieved. He had never seen a real elf before, but they had to be better than dragons.
Well, whoever used to live here, they're gone now, Warren said. Let's have a look around.
Why did the elves leave the city? Garrett asked, looking back at Marla as he followed the ghoul down the tunnel.
Humans came and conquered the city,
Marla said, her eyes still on the ruined walls as she walked. Shadirians?
No,
Marla smiled.
This was long before the rise of the Empire. It was a war between humankind and the children of the dragon.
So elves were made by dragons too?
Yes,
Marla said. What about ghouls? Garrett asked. Warren snorted.
Ghouls came down from the moon. Nobody made us.
Garrett gave Marla a questioning look. She shrugged.
I don't know exactly where ghouls came from, she said. They aren't fey, but they aren't completely natural either.
Garrett hesitated before speaking again. What about vampires? Marla smiled shyly and glanced away.
We were once human, she said.
Ah, Garrett said. So you and your mom got bitten by a vampire or something? Marla laughed.
No,
she said.
I was born a vampire. Mother was too.
And your dad? Garrett asked. Marla stopped walking, her face troubled. I'm sorry, Garrett said. Marla raised her hand to silence him. She looked back over her shoulder suddenly as a ghostly white shape sprung at them from the darkness.
Die, worm spawn!
The creature howled as it leapt upon the vampire girl. Marla and the creature rolled across the tunnel floor. Warren! Garrett cried out. He reached for the knife Cynic had given him, but found the scabbard hanging empty on his belt. Marla now held the knife to the white-furred creature's throat as she pinned him to the floor.
Norris, you fap! Warren shouted. You're lucky she didn't kill you.
The white ghoul looked up at Warren with a long-toothed grin.
Just playing, cousin,
he said, his voice a low growl. Marla stood and stepped away, glaring at her attacker as she passed the knife back to Garrett. Norris rolled onto one elbow and lifted a long-fingered claw toward his cousin. Warren ignored it, stepping over the prostrate ghoul as he addressed Marla.
Are you all right?
Yes,
she said.
I'm sorry about that,
Warren said to her, and then turned on his cousin.
What's wrong with you?
Norris helped himself up and dusted off his white haunches.
Just a bit of fun, cousin,
he said with a gravelly purr. If the two ghouls were truly cousins, they were distant ones. Norris possessed a far more wolf-like and stooped appearance, seemingly ready to pounce at any moment. His sleek fur shone a ghostly white, unlike Warren's shaggy gray mane. Norris's placating grin bore an unsettling feral quality, and when he spoke, his voice wavered somewhere between a whine and a snarl.
Where are you off to then, cousin?
Norris asked, stroking his long-nailed fingers over his hairy knuckles.
We were on our way down to Nunna,
Warren answered.
Nunna?
Norris cocked his head to one side.
None of your business, Norris,
Warren growled. Norris looked away, laughing. It was not the manic chuckle common to the ghouls that Garrett had met, but a dry, hissing sort of laugh.
Really, cousin? No call to be rude. I was hoping we could spend a bit more time together before I have to leave. So I came looking for you, and here you were, with friends. Yeah,
Warren said, stepping between Marla and Garrett and draping his long arms over their shoulders.
I like to spend time with my friends. So, good seeing you, Norris.
Marla's brow furrowed, but she managed a crooked smile as she glanced at Garrett. He gathered she had never been this close to a ghoul before. Their aroma took some getting used to.
Ah, you're the Necromancer friend.
Norris tilted his head toward Garrett.
Handy in a fight, ain't he?
Garrett's glove leather creaked as his fists tightened. Warren let out a warning growl. Norris sniffed loudly as though catching a scent.
And the vampiress.
He bowed before Marla with surprising grace.
My apologies, Dark One.
Marla stiffened, her eyes hard. After a moment, she nodded at the white ghoul.
All is forgiven, she said. I trust that I did not injure you?
Norris flashed his unnerving smile once again.
Quite well,
he said.
No harm at all. We're so glad of that,
Warren said flatly.
Well, we better get going. Shame you're not going to Malrovin,
Norris crooned.
Garrett's seen it already.
Warren said, guiding his friends farther away from his cousin.
But I chance your vampire friend has not,
Norris said.
Malrovin?
Marla asked. Warren groaned. It's where they live, Garrett said. The ghouls of Wither.
Yes,
Norris said.
The great burrow of the city ghouls, not to be missed. I'll show her some other day,
Warren said.
But the king is giving a speech today,
Norris said with a snickering laugh.
The king?
Garrett asked.
I didn't know you guys had a king.
Warren rubbed a paw over his face.
He doesn't come out very often. He's crazy. He's not even a ghoul.
Such disrespect for royalty.
Norris chuckled.
Have you no loyalty to your king?
We only made the Goblin King because we thought it was funny,
Warren said.
A goblin? Marla said. You have a real goblin?
Indeed they do,
Norris said. What's so special about a goblin? Garrett asked. Marla turned to him.
There are hardly any of them left, she said. Most of them died in the war between men and dragons.
Oh, Garrett said. Whose side were they on?
The dragons, of course.
So they're fey creatures too? Garrett asked.
Sort of, she said. The dragons made them, but it was after the death of their mother. Their songs were twisted with grief and rage. Everything they made after that came out wrong.
All the dragons had the same mother?
Yes,
she said. What happened to her? Marla gave him an exasperated look.
She drowned herself in a puddle after having to listen to too much boring history stuff,
Warren moaned.
Can we get going? Can we go see the goblin?
Marla asked, looking from Garrett to Warren and back again. The pleading look in her eyes made Garrett go a little weak in the knees. Warren's glare had no such effect on him.